Hey everybody, in this video we're going to look at another feature that's being shipped with the version 5 update for Ionic, and that is the gesture controller. So in the last video that I just released, we covered the Ionic Animations API that's also shipping with Ionic 5. And also if you want to just have a general understanding of what the upgrade process from version 4 to version 5 might look like, I stressed in the last video that it's hopefully, if you've been keeping your applications up to date, it's not going to be a big deal. There's very few breaking changes and a bunch of cool new features that are shipping with Ionic 5. So I'll link to that video if you want to go check that out, get a bit of background on Ionic 5 in general first. But I have the same application that I was playing around with in the last video. This is the Ionic 4 conference app, which I just bumped up to version 5 of Ionic. And I've been playing around with some of the features that are available now. So in this video, we're going to focus on the new gesture controller. And so it's not actually new functionality, it's something that has been in Ionic for a little while now, I think since Ionic 4. I'm not entirely sure, but it was previously just an internal thing that Ionic were using. So they were making use of this gesture controller, but it wasn't exposed and available for us to use, which is being changed now. And so I have the changelog for our Ionic up here, and in one of the beta releases for 5.0, look through here, you can see here we have under the features of the first beta, or I suppose is the second beta because it started at 0, I think. It says expose Ionic gestures via gesture controller. So we're going to take a look at the code for that just to have a brief understanding of what's happening here. So I'm just going to click on this commit here, and we're going to take a look at the code that was changed with this feature being added. And if you also want a bit of an introduction into how to browse through an open source code base like this to try and get a better understanding of code and features that either maybe they don't have documentation yet, or the documentation isn't great, or just so you can see what's actually happening, I'll link to a video I did previously on that. So we can see in this commit here, the code that has been changed to expose the gesture controller, which isn't a whole lot. Basically, the functionality for the gesture controller is already available through Ionic Core, and that's what Ionic has been using. So all this change does is add a gesture controller class here that we can use and inject into our Angular applications to make use of the gesture system that Ionic has been using themselves. And so the basic idea with these gestures is that we can recognize some kind of gesture that the user has been touching on the screen of their device or using a mouse or whatever. So we can define what we want that gesture to be and how we want to react to those movements. And so we're going to be focusing on an Angular example in a moment. We're just going to create a silly little, I guess it's kind of like a basic implementation of the general idea of like a Tinder card, like a swipe right, swipe left kind of thing. But you should also be able to use this stuff in Stencil.js, React, wherever. It is provided through Ionic Core, so you should be able to just import these things and use them directly rather than having to have this wrapper that's been created for Angular. I haven't actually tried it myself in other frameworks or in Stencil.js yet, so don't take my word for it, but it should work. So before we jump into doing a quick example ourselves, another thing that is useful in trying to understand code that you don't understand is to look to see how Ionic themselves have been using this thing. So as I said, this already exists. Ionic has been using it, so it's useful to look through their code and see how they are making use of it. Now, I don't think there is documentation available for the gesture controller yet. I may be wrong about that, but this is a good way to sort of understand things if there is no documentation available. So what we're going to do first is just have a quick look at the Ionic toggle component. The reason I wanted to take a look at this one and their implementation for the gesture controller here, or gestures here, is that toggle is a pretty basic component. We touch the toggle and it does its toggle animation. So there's not really any complex gestures going on here. And so what we can do in the code for this toggle component is just search for where the gesture is being used. So I'm just going to search for instances of gesture here. And then you can see down here, this is the gesture is being created under the connected callback method here. Now it is worth mentioning that we are in Stencil.js land right now. So this is a Stencil.js component, and all of Ionic's components are components built with Stencil.js. So this code that we're looking at is an Angular code, but you can still see the basic idea of how the gesture controller would work. Because all the gesture controller does, as I mentioned, is it's just a light wrapper over the top of the standard Ionic core gesture functionality. So we can see here we're defining it on this .gesture, and we're calling the create gesture method, which is the same thing that the Angular wrapper does here. And then we are passing in a bunch of options. So we have an element option here, and we're passing in this .l. And if we look further back up the top, we can see that element is just a reference to the component itself. And again, this is Stencil.js code here, but basically what's going on here is we're saying give us a reference to the DOM element that this component is. So we're passing that in here, so that means this is where we want our gesture listener to be. So when this toggle is being interacted with, this is the functionality we want to set up to listen for our gestures. And so it's given a name. There is a priority and a threshold here. I'm not actually 100% sure what these options control exactly. I assume this is some kind of giving one gesture precedence over another, but I haven't actually looked into this stuff yet. But we'll just talk about the basics of this for now. And you can see we have these three methods here. We have an onStart, onMove, and onEnd. And so this method is going to run when the gesture is first detected, when it's starting. OnMove is going to run this callback function every time that there is a change. So if your finger is sliding around the screen, this is going to fire off a lot of times, and it's going to report on the details of what is currently happening. So where the finger is on the screen, how far it's moved from the origin, that kind of thing. And then the onEnd method will trigger once the gesture has been finished. And so basically we can find out the gesture started, here's what's happening at the moment with the gesture, and now the gesture has ended. And so we can use those methods to define a lot of different types of functionality. And we can just implement some kind of logic to determine what we want to do with those movements. So let's have a quick look at what Ion toggle is doing here. So we have onStart, onMove, onEnd. So you can see we have our onStart method here, and there's not really a whole lot happening. We're just setting activated to true on start. OnMove, we have some bit of logic going. There we're checking the delta X, which is the change in the X position. And then onEnd, we're changing the activated property again, and also just, I assume, handling some sort of edge case stuff here, stopping events from propagating. One problem with looking, I guess, at the Ionic's implementation of this stuff is that they have optimized this stuff to a very large degree. So there's going to be a lot of code here that makes it more complicated, I guess. But we can still get a pretty good idea of what's happening. So that's a basic implementation of Ionic using the gesture system. Another more complex example, which I want to take a quick look at, we're not going to dive too deeply into it, but I do want to show you how it can get more complex. And you can see, for example, with when using the Ion menu, we have these sort of gestures where we can slide it in from the right. So we can click on there, and I don't think we can actually slide on the sliding items, but if we drag, if I sort of click and drag or swipe from the background somewhere, I can pull out that menu. And so there's this sort of global gesture listener happening on the sort of document element itself to trigger that gesture to recognize this as a, the user just swiped near the edge there. So I want to open that menu. So let's take a quick look at that. So if we look at the menu code again, we can search through here for gesture and see what is happening. And you can see, again, we have a similar sort of setup here. This is another Stencil.js component. We're using create gesture, passing in the element. This time, the document itself is being passed in because we want to listen basically to the entire application rather than one specific section or component. And we have the onStart, onMove, onEnd methods, but we also have some additional methods here, canStart and onWillStart. And so this will check if the gesture, I guess, is allowed. So there are some circumstances where we don't want the menu to pop out with a swipe. Ionic does provide the menu controller, for example, where we might choose to disable the interaction with the menu. So maybe depending on some logic, we will or won't want the menu to be able to be opened. So let's have a quick look again at the onStart and the various methods for this menu component. So you can see here onStart, again, pretty simple. onMove, we have some stuff happening. onEnd, we get quite a lot more complex. There's some different things checking velocities and lots of the sort of delta comparisons here. And so this is quite a bit more complex, and there's probably other components as well that are going to be even more complex than this, that are using more complicated gestures. But we can create our own gestures without having to do anything crazy and complex like the menu here. Of course we can if we know how to and we're at that level. But what I want to do is show you an example of this in practice. So what I've done here is I've set up the gesture controller on this image here. So just on the support page, this Ionic logo image, I just wanted to create a silly gesture on something just to illustrate how we can use it. And you can basically attach it to anything, and I'm attaching it to this image here. And I'm gonna define some funky functionality on this logo. So I'll take a quick look in the code. In here, we are importing the gesture controller. We are injecting it through the constructor as you typically would with an Angular application. And what I've done here in the ng after view init, I am setting up this gesture by calling this .gestureController.create. So I await that gesture to be created. So it's similarly to like the modal controller, for example. And then I call gesture.enable true. Now, I've also got some other code here to show a more complex example of that sort of Tinder swipe card functionality that I mentioned. But let's just go through the basics first. So I'm passing in this .logo.native element. So all I've done is set up a reference here to the image by setting up that local variable there. And then I'm grabbing that with a view child. And so I'm grabbing a reference to the element ref, again, which is an Angular thing. If you're not familiar with that, this is just basically a way we can grab the DOM element that is this logo. That's why I'm passing in the native element. If you weren't using Angular, this is going to look a bit different, but the basic idea is you pass in the DOM element that you want to attach this gesture to. I've just given it a name, priority and threshold. And then I have my three main methods, onStart, onMove, and onEnd. So right now, all I'm doing is onStart, I'm logging out starting. OnMove, I log out the move event, and onEnd, I log out ending and the end event. So let's just see what that looks like. So I'm going to jump back into the browser here. Now, if I just sort of swipe around on this logo element, you can see that we have all these events popping up. So we have our first starting event, then we have this pan event, and it says where it started in the X and Y coordinates, where it is currently in the X and Y, the velocity, so how fast we might be swiping, the change in the delta X and delta Y. So we have all this data that we have and can make use of. And that is how we're going to go about defining our gestures and what we want to happen when those gestures are detected. So let me just uncomment what I have done here. So the basic idea is I'm using the Angular renderer here, which I don't want to turn this into a tutorial on the renderer, but the important thing to know here is that the renderer in Angular is just allowing me to set the style of a particular element programmatically. So I'm only using this to just change some style properties on the logo element. So what I'm doing on move is I'm using the renderer to change the style of the transform, and I'm setting the translate X to whatever that delta X value is from the event. So for every change in the X value, if I'm moving to the right, I want to transform the image so that it is also moving to the right with my gesture. And the same goes for the other direction as well. If we're moving to the left, we're going to change that X direction to the left, but we're not doing anything with the Y coordinate. So it's just going to move in this horizontal axis. So let's just take a look at that first and see what that looks like. So now if I try to drag this, you can see I can drag to the left and right, which is pretty cool already. So now I've got this interactive functionality and I can drag it in this horizontal direction. If I let go, it's just going to stay there. If I click around, the functionality is going to start to get a bit trippy as the positions of things are changing. But in general, I can move it left to right, which is pretty cool. So now I want to handle something that happens, well, when I let go, when I finish this gesture, I want to do something. It's a bit pointless me just dragging this thing around the screen. I want to be able to perform some functionality. So what I have set up here, first of all, is I'm setting a transition here just so it eases back into its position nicely when it resets to the middle, rather than just snapping back. So we have a transition there that's going to just smoothly let that logo glide back into place. And then I have some logic here to do different things based on the position of where the gesture ends. So basically, this is just a very simple implementation. You would want to make some improvements for this if this was a actual Tinder application you were creating. But what I'm checking for here is for the delta X value. I'm saying if it's greater than 125. And so let's do a little test here, for example. So I'm going to drag it to about here. And we're going to check this last event. And you can see, well, the delta X is almost exactly 125. It's just over. So at that point and onwards, I'm saying I want to do something. And that something is I want to just swoosh it off the screen. But if I was to stop it, say, here, for example, let me just refresh this so it's a bit more accurate. So if I just pull this to, say, here and let go, well, I don't want anything to happen in this case. I just want to pop it back into its normal resting place. So if I check the delta X here, I can see it's 70, which is less than 125. And likewise, I also want to do it across the other side if it's less than negative 125, which is going to be over the left-hand side of the screen. So let's say if I pulled it right to the edge there, let's check that event. And we can see the delta X is negative 172, which is enough to trigger this second type of functionality. But in any other case, I just want to reset the logo back to its normal resting position. So I just set the translate X back to 0, whereas in these cases, I'm just animating it off screen. So let's save this now and take a look at what this functionality looks like. So I'll give that another refresh. So now let's just drag it a little bit and I'll let go, and you can see it just snaps nicely back to its normal resting position, which should be the same on the left here. I can just sort of drag it around a little bit. Maybe I'm not so sure about this person. Maybe I like them, maybe I don't. I've never actually used Tinder in my life. But when I start to get more decisive, I'm like, nah, or yes, I'm not sure. I think right is the yes option. I pull them over here and now they've swooshed that way and we can start our new lives together or whatever. So obviously I would need a way to reset this to bring up the next person or whatever. But yeah, I can sort of drag this left and right, drag it off to the left, drag it off to the right, and it's just going to swoosh away. And on top of just having that kind of animation, we can also build some more logic into this. So I could also add a call to some method in here that's going to then trigger adding that person to my list of people or whatever. So this is a really cool way to control gestures, detect gestures, define how they happen, what should happen during the gesture, where things on the screen should be going, and then what sort of functionality should happen in response to certain types of behaviors. Before I go, I do want to say that I wouldn't recommend building, usually, these sorts of gestures directly into a page like this. I'm just doing this as an example of using the gesture controller. Typically, you'd have some kind of custom component, and this functionality would be attached to the component itself, and then you could just use that component elsewhere in your application. But there's probably also examples where maybe you do want to use gestures just in a standard page like this. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.